أهلا وسهلا بحضراتكم في فعاليات المؤتمر العلمي ومع الندوة الأخيرة الخامسة والأخيرة. تنقسم لجزئين. الجزء الأول: هل للجهاز التنفسي تأثيرات سلبية على مستويات التحمل للرياضيين؟ والجزء الثاني: تصنيف الأنشطة الرياضية طبقا للشدة الواقعة على الجهاز العظمي، منظور حديث. وطبعا بنرحب بالاساتذه اللي موجوده معانا، رئيس الندوه الاستاذ الدكتور وائل ابن عمر مرعي الحضرمي، استاذ مشارك ومدير الجامعه المفتوحه فرع المدينه المنوره السعوديه. مقرر الندوه الاستاذ الدكتور السيد سليمان حماد، استاذ الصحه الرياضيه. المتحدث الاول الدكتور باولو دومينيلي، جامعه ووتربولو كندا. المتحدث الثاني الاستاذ الدكتور مجدي ابو زيد، مقرر اللجنه العلميه لترقيه الاساتذه بمصر، جامعه الاسكندريه، حاصل على جائزه الامير فيصل، واستاذ زائر بجامعه سوان كوريا الجنوبيه. كما يعني نرحب بالترجمه الفوريه الاستاذه جمعون ريان.
السلام عليكم. معكم المترجمه جمعون ريان من جامعه محمد لمين دباغين، الصيف 2 الجزائر. Good afternoon, Dr. Paolo Dominelli. My name is Ryan Jamon, and I'm going to be your translator. You may proceed with your symposium.
دكتور وائل موجود؟ دكتور وائل.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. Just give me 2 seconds here to load up my talk.
نعم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Great. Is everyone able to see that okay?
Yes, everything is clear, sir. You may proceed.
Perfect. Thank you. So thank you, everyone, for the invite to talk today. Really exciting to give this. So what I'm going to be presenting on are the rest.
Dr. Paolo,
just if we can wait a second for the president of
Dr.
the chair of the session is going to just introduce you, please.
First, Dr. Paolo, we need to introduce the topic of the conference, and then introduce the speakers, and then we'll give you the opportunity, inshallah, for 30 minutes to present your issue. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. حاب أرحب بجميع الزملاء. دكتور سيد معايا؟ دكتور سيد موجود؟
مع حضرتك يا دكتور، مع حضرتك إن شاء الله.
ممتاز. بس حبيت أتأكد أنكم بتسمعوني يعني، فقط لا غير.
تمام يا دكتور، تفضل حضرتك.
طيب، بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. معكم أخوكم الدكتور وائل الحضرمي، سابقا رئيس قسم التربية البدنية وعلوم الرياضة بجامعة طيبة بالمدينة المنورة. حاليا مدير فرع الجامعة العربية المفتوحة أيضا بالمدينة المنورة. لاعب دولي في تنس الطاولة، مثلت منتخب المملكة يعني لفترات طويلة في جميع الفئات. أتشرف جدا بتواجدي معكم في هذه الندوة مع أساتذة كبار أمثالكم، ويسعدني أن أقدم المؤتمر العلمي الدولي الافتراضي الأول، الرياضة والصحة، أمن قومي عربي أفريقي. ولعلي يعني أعرف بأجزاء الندوة، وهي الندوة الخامسة. الجزء الأول: هل للجهاز التنفسي تأثيرات سلبية على مستويات التحمل للرياضيين؟ الجزء الثاني: تصنيف الأنشطة الرياضية طبقا للشدة الواقعة على الجهاز العظمي، منظور حديث. هذه حتكون بإذن الله محاور الندوة اللي سيعلق ويفيدنا فيها ويعطينا من علمهم فيها المتحدثان. أيضا يسعدني أن أعرف بمقرر الندوة، سعادة الأستاذ الدكتور السيد سليمان حماد. سعادة الدكتور البروفيسور سليمان حماد هو أستاذ دكتور في الصحة الرياضية، قسم العلوم الحيوية والصحية الرياضية، كلية التربية الرياضية للبنين، جامعة اسكندرية بمصر الشقيقة. قام بالتدريس لمرحلة البكالوريوس والدراسات العليا بكلية التربية الرياضية للبنين جامعة الإسكندرية، كما أشرف سعادته على المناقشة لأكثر من 60 بحث ماجستير ودكتوراه في مجال الصحة والرياضة والتربية الصحية وتغذية الرياضيين وفسيولوجيا الرياضة ببعض كليات التربية الرياضية بجمهورية مصر العربية. نشر أكثر من 18 بحث علمي في مجال الصحة الرياضية والتربية الصحية والتغذية الرياضية وفسيولوجيا الرياضة بالمجالات العلمية المحلية والدولية، مخطط برامج تغذية الرياضيين ببعض الأندية الصحية، المشاركة في تنظيم بعض المؤتمرات العلمية التي نظمتها كلية التربية الرياضية للبنين جامعة الإسكندرية. له مؤلفات علمية في التربية الصحية للرياضيين، وأيضا مؤلفات علمية في التربية الصحية المدرسية وعلوم الصحة والرياضة. أيضا أود أن أعرف بالمتحدث الأول في هذه الندوة بمشيئة الله، اللي هو دكتور باولو. Dr. Paolo Dominelli is an assistant professor in respiratory physiology at the Department of Kinesiology, University of Waterloo, Canada. Also, Dr. Paolo completed his undergraduate and PhD in human kinetics at the University of British Columbia, also in Canada. He completed a postdoctoral training at my clinic in the USA, United States of America. Dr. Paolo research focused on the understanding the cardiorespiratory control during exercise. This is for Dr. Paolo. Now I would like to introduce the second speaker, سعادة الأستاذ الدكتور مجدي أبو زيد. طبعا سعادة البروفيسور مجدي هو أستاذ دكتور في جامعة اسكندرية كلية التربية الرياضية للبنين في أبو قير جمهورية مصر العربية. له خبرة قرابة 45 عاما ما شاء الله من الخبرات في مجال التدريس الجامعي، إجراء البحوث العلمية، نشر أكثر من 80 بحثا في المجالات العربية والدولية، الحصول على العديد من الجوائز العلمية الدولية، أستاذ زائر في العديد من الجامعات الدولية، نائب رئيس الاتحاد الدولي لرياضة رمي الكرة، أستاذ تدريب السباحة في كلية التربية الرياضية للبنين في أبو قير، مقرر للجنة العلمية الدائمة لترقية الأساتذة والأساتذة المساعدين، تدريب رياضي للمجلس الأعلى للجامعات. الآن قمنا بالتعريف بالأخوة الزملاء المقررين وأيضا المتحدثين. سيتم إجراء الندوة كالتالي: المتحدث الأول بمشيئة الله سيكون الدكتور باولو، ثم المتحدث الثاني سيكون سعادة البروفيسور مجدي. فأترك الكلمة إذا كان في أي شيء عند سعادة الدكتور السيد سليمان قبل أن نبدأ مع سعادة الدكتور باولو. في حاجة حاب تضيفها دكتور السيد؟
بشكر حضرتك طبعا دكتور وائل، وبرحب بالاساتذه المتحدثين التو سبيكر، استاذنا الفاضل الاستاذ الدكتور مجدي ابو زيد والبروفيسور دكتور باولو. نتمنى مشاركه سعيده لحضراتكم ان شاء الله باذن الله في الندوه. شكرا جزيلا دكتور.
الله يحييك يا دكتور. Okay, Dr. Paolo, you have now 30 minutes inshallah to present what you have, and then we'll have 5 minutes for 5 minutes open for questions. So go ahead, please.
Perfect. And do you want me to stop after every section for a translation or just continue throughout?
Translation, Dr. Said.
Dr. Paolo Dominelli, I will be translating after you have finished your symposium, so feel free to speak.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, thank you.
Perfect. So thank you everyone for the invitation to come and speak today. So today what I'll be talking about is the respiratory limitations to exercise. So largely what I'm going to be talking about was covered actually in a lecture given actually in the mid-'80s by Dr. Jerry Dempsey, who's a quite famous respiratory physiologist. And really he posed a similar question in that, do the lungs and respiratory muscles, do they limit exercise? And he used this schematic to describe a lot of it. So I'll be coming back to this a few times today. But what we're really looking at here is, we look at this individual on the left that's drawn out. Well, what's limiting exercise here? And how it's kind of drawn is it's trying to depict that the lungs here and the chest wall, they're kind of leading the way. So they are most likely not limiting exercise. And that's probably the heart and the skeletal muscles. But that might not be the case when we now start considering a person who is highly trained here, or an individual with a VO2 max, say up into the mid-70s. So with that in mind, so as a brief outline, so I'll be looking first at, well, what's the respiratory limitation to exercise in healthy individuals? And then I'll move into considering the aspects of high respiratory muscle work and exercise-induced arterial hypoxemia. Both of these I'll talk more in relation to more trained individuals. Again, some of it a little bit more towards elite athletics. And then finally, I'll end off with some sex differences in respiratory physiology. So if we start with some healthy untrained individuals. So what's the role of the respiratory system during exercise? Well, really what it's supposed to be doing, or what we want it to do, is to maintain blood gas homeostasis. That's its primary role during exercise. Now, at the same time, though, this should be accomplished with minimal effort. So in other words, we don't want this goal or this achievement of blood gas homeostasis to be taking up a considerable amount of your energy expenditure. We want it to use as little energy as possible. And so that then really begs the question is, does the respiratory system limit exercise performance? And again, we'll start off with untrained individuals. So this is just some graphs I pulled off of a recent review that we wrote. And this will probably be familiar with most people. These are just the general response to exercise. So on the x-axis here, we have exercise intensity starting at rest, going all the way up to max exercise. It's intentionally unitless. And then the y-axis is, again, just a unitless scale to show the relative change in different variables throughout exercise. Again, I assume this will be familiar. Most people, you have a rise in ventilation, then near some threshold, you'll get an exponential rise in ventilation. This is achieved through initially a large rise in tidal volume, which generally plateaus out, and then you have this rise in breathing frequency. And the important aspect is if we look at our arterial blood gases now, shown in the top panels here, if we focus in on the middle one here, our arterial oxygen tension, what you can see is from rest all the way to max exercise, you essentially get no change in your arterial oxygen tension. So your body is really well able to maintain this blood gas homeostasis. You get a little bit of a change in your arterial carbon dioxide tension. That's just due to this hyperventilation in your maximal exercise. And you might have a small change in your oxyhemoglobin saturation, again, due to mainly changes in temperature and pH. But in general, we can say, well, any gas exchange impairment across the lungs are quite minimal. And oxygen levels do not change from rest at all. So we can achieve this blood gas homeostasis through this nicely increasing ventilation and through this efficient breathing pattern. So in general, in untrained, healthy people, there's really no gas exchange impairments, and oxygen levels really aren't changing all that much from rest. So now one way we can look at how is this being achieved is we can look at things called the maximal expiratory flow volume loops. So on this graph here, we have lung volume on our x-axis. So just by convention, we actually have this flipped. So towards the origin here would be the highest lung volume. And then we have flow on our y-axis. Anything above this dotted line here would be positive flow, so that'd be expiration. So how you garner this loop is you'd have somebody take a fully deep breath all the way in. So they fill up their lungs completely. They would be at this lung volume right here. Then you have them expire as hard and as forcefully as possible. And you get this nice rise in flow, and then it'll roughly linearly drop as they drop their lung volume. And then this inner loop here is what we refer to as the tidal flow volume loop. So this is the same, except this is what they're doing during exercise. So again, this would be a breath in, going from right to left, and then this would be our breath out here. So this outer loop we say is impenetrable. So in other words, you have to, any combination of flow and volume have to occur under this curve here. And so we can see here this tidal loop during maximal exercise there's still quite a lot of room. There's a lot of room both to change your lung volume, but also to increase your expiratory flow. So what we take out of this is in an untrained individual, there's actually a lot of capacity to increase their ventilation more than what they typically achieve at maximal exercise. And this is just one way to show it, in that there's a lot more room to increase both flow and volume at max exercise in these untrained people. Now, if we follow to the respiratory muscle energetics, so again, this is the principle that we should accomplish this blood gas homeostasis with as minimal work as possible. So on this axis, or on this graph, sorry, we have ventilation on our x-axis, and we have our work of breathing on our y-axis. So the work of breathing is just a measure of how hard the respiratory muscles, and when I say respiratory muscles, I mean all of the respiratory muscles together, how hard are they working? So if we look at a typical value at max exercise for an untrained person, for this case, we'll use an untrained male, somewhere 100, 120 would be reasonable. And you can see that their mechanical work is just above about 200 joules. I realize these units might not mean a lot to many people not familiar with this, but if we now look at the oxygen requirement to do this work, so the respiratory muscles, like all other muscles, as work goes up, so does their oxygen consumption. So in this graph here, now we have again ventilation on our x-axis, except on our y-axis now we have the VO2, or the oxygen consumption of our respiratory muscles. So again, if we look at just over 100 liters per minute ventilation, the oxygen consumption of the respiratory muscles is about 200 milliliters. Or again, in a typical untrained individual, this may be upwards of about 5% of their total VO2. In other words, 5% of their total VO2 is being dedicated to their respiratory muscles. Again, this isn't overly taxing on the body. So as a summary for this first section, so in young healthy individuals, the respiratory system is really able to maintain arterial oxygen levels near rest. Even at maximal exercise, the respiratory system has ample capacity to increase ventilation. So it's not that there's a limit on how much an individual can breathe. And then this blood gas homeostasis, it's really achieved with fairly minimal effort. So it doesn't come at a huge energetic cost to the body. So what happens though when an individual trains? So if you have an individual and they go from having a VO2 max of say 40 mils per kilo, and they train quite extensively, and now they have a VO2 max upwards of 75 mils per kilo. Well, what happens during that training? Well, if we look at this schematically, the locomotor muscles are going to get quite stronger and more efficient. The heart is going to get somewhat bigger and again, more efficient. So these are going to show positive training adaptations. Unfortunately though, your respiratory muscles may show some, albeit very minor adaptations, and your lungs essentially show absolutely no adaptation to long-term training. So whereas in this untrained individuals, the lungs are really not falling behind. You could think of it as they're leading the body systems. When you now start looking at this very highly trained individual, it may actually be the lungs here that are limiting exercise performance because they haven't adapted, whereas these other systems, mainly your skeletal muscles and your cardiac physiology, they have adapted considerably to exercise. So if we look at this now, let's look at what happens with these trained individuals. So here I'm showing the exact same graph, except now I've just extended it out a little farther. So this would be typical of say a highly trained individuals. Again, we have ventilation on our x-axis here, but now it's coming out to 150 or even 200 liters a minute, which would be a very highly trained individual's ventilation at max exercise. What you notice here is the work of breathing actually increases in a curvilinear fashion as it starts to get above, again, approximately about 100 liters per minute. So now you can see that their energetic cost of breathing is 3 or 4 times higher than this untrained individual at max exercise. And if we look at their oxygen consumption in the respiratory muscles, this too has gone up considerably. So again, we have our ventilation on our x-axis here and our VO2 of the respiratory muscles on our y-axis. And you can see here, it shows the same curvilinear relationship we found. And even an individual with a VO2 max, say, of 60 milliliters per kilo, so they're well trained, but not considered an elite athlete. Now we're getting about 10% of their total VO2 is dedicated to the respiratory muscles. And as you get even higher or more well-trained individuals, it can get upwards of 15 or greater percent. So this is now a considerable aspect of your whole body's oxygen consumption is now being dedicated just to breathing, just to be able to try to maintain that blood gas homeostasis. So you might ask, well, what does actually this high worker breathing matter? Well, this actually has quite a lot of implications. So the study that I'm going to talk about here was done in the late 90s here. And what they did is they had a bunch of well-trained men with VO2 max around 64 mils per kilo. And they performed a series of short but very intense exercise bouts on the cycloergometer. So they're above 90% of their VO2 max. They only did it for about 2 or 3 minutes. And what they did is they had 3 experimental conditions. So one of them, the circles shown here, that was the control. So that was just spontaneously breathing, no intervention at all. And they also did some trials shown by the squares here, typically on the left, where they unloaded the respiratory muscles. So what I mean by that is they lowered the person's work of breathing. And on average, they lowered it about 64%. And then in the condition with the triangles, this is the loading condition. So here, they actually increased the work of breathing on the individuals by about 30%. So if we now look at the graph here, we have work of breathing on our x-axis. So 100% is relative to our control condition. So anything greater than that, that is our loading. So they've made the work of the respiratory muscles harder. Largely, they've done this by having people breathe through a small resistance. And then anything to the left of 100% here is a lower work of breathing. So they've made it easier on the respiratory muscles. And they did this via a specialized ventilator. And then on the y-axis here, we have blood flow to the legs. So this is measured directly with the thermodilution technique. And so similarly, anything below 100% means there's less blood flow going to the locomotor muscles. Anything above means there's more blood flow. What you can see here is if you decrease the work of breathing, so you go to the left on this relationship, you get an increase in locomotor blood flow. And if you increase the work of breathing, you get a decrease in locomotor blood flow. So this is important because the work these individuals performed was identical. So by altering your work of breathing, you can now change the amount of blood flow that's actually going to these working muscles. So the question though, after that study was really, well, where is that blood flow going when you increase the work of breathing? Likewise, well, where is it actually coming from when you decrease the work of breathing? So we tried to tackle this question a few years ago. And what we did, we had, again, some highly trained cyclists, and they performed intense exercise, very similar to the last experimental model where we increased the work of breathing. We also decreased the work of breathing. And what we did uniquely here is we injected a green tracer dye here called indocyanine green. You can just see it being injected here. And this allowed us to quantify blood flow to both the locomotor muscles. So you can see some probes here on the subject's quadricep. And then what you can't quite see, but it's on the other side of their neck, is we're able to measure blood flow to some accessory respiratory muscles. So this is the unique aspect of the study. And if we look at this, again, similar graphs here. We have work of breathing on our x-axis. On the left-hand y-axis, we have sternocleidomastoid blood flow. This is an accessory respiratory muscle. And then on this right-hand side one, we have vastus lateralis blood flow. So again, what you notice here is if you increase the work of breathing, blood flow to these respiratory muscles goes up. You decrease it, it goes down. And again, we're showing the same relationship, where as you decrease the work of breathing, blood flow to the locomotor muscles goes up. And when you increase it, it goes down. Just for kind of, as people may notice, these two what seem to be outliers. Even if you remove these two subjects here, this relationship is significant, but just we thought it was important to include them regardless. But the conclusion of this is there's this bidirectional change in blood flow between the respiratory muscles and locomotor muscles when you alter this work of breathing. So with that, you might ask, okay, well, again, what's going to happen when you alter blood flow? So this was done by, again, it's studied by Jerry Dempsey's group. And they had a series, or a bunch of well-trained men, they had VO2 max about just under 60 mils per kilo, and they completed 2 exercise trials of identical duration and intensity. And so these were quite exhaustive. They're above about 90% of VO2 max. And after these trials, as you'd expect, they developed some degree of quadricep fatigue. We see this in this figure here. So 0 would be no fatigue, and then as we get this smaller numbers, this is indicating a loss of function in their quadriceps. So after the control condition, they showed about 25–30% fatigue, so less force was generated by their quadricep, and this is what you'd expect. When they did the condition where they unloaded their work of breathing, so the PAV, this is a proportional assist ventilator, it's just a way to unload the respiratory muscles, you can see the locomotor fatigue was significantly less. So again, remember, they completed the exact same exercise trial, the exact same duration and intensity, but they were able to unload the respiratory muscles, which increased blood flow, and it objectively lessened the amount of quadricep fatigue. At the same time, if we look at their ratings of perceived exertion on the y-axis here, and then looked at it over the different minutes of this time to exhaustion, you can see that during the trial where they unloaded the work of breathing, their perception of effort was lower. So their RPE, or relative perceived exertion of their legs, was significantly lower at many time points. So not only were they objectively less fatigued, but they felt less fatigued despite doing the exact same amount of work. So for this one, lowering the work of breathing with this ventilator, it both decreased quadricep fatigue and it decreased the perceived exertion of the legs. So now if we look very specifically at performance metrics. So in this study here, they had, again, some highly trained individuals. They did a time to exhaustion test at about 90% of VO2 max, so just how long could they exercise continuously. And they did this under a control condition, again, no intervention. Unload, then we're unloading the respiratory muscles, about 50% in this case, and then increasing the work of the respiratory muscles by 50%. So in this graph here, on the x-axis, we have the control condition and the time, and on the y-axis, we have the experimental time. So anything that is above this line of identity here means that they went longer, and anything below means it was a shorter time. So what you can see here is, barring a few exceptions here, almost every instance when you unload the respiratory muscles, shown with these open shapes, they were able to exercise longer. Likewise, when you increase the work of the respiratory muscles, they're not able to exercise as long. Okay, so this was about 15% either way. So unloading increased performance by about 15%, and loading the respiratory muscles decreased performance by about 15%. So we actually followed this up with another study and really questioned, well, what would be the effect if you unloaded the respiratory muscles to a lesser degree? Because the previous one was about 50%, so that's a fairly strong stimulus. So what we questioned is, well, what happens if we unloaded it just a little bit, say 15% of it? And we accomplished this using having the subjects breathe a heliox gas. And heliox is just oxygen with helium as a backing gas, and this lowers the work of breathing by promoting laminar flow. What you can see here again, so on the x-axis, we have our room air time trial, so it's just breathing typical room air, and then our helium time trial. You can see, while subtle, there was a significant effect in both men and women in that you had about a 3 and a 6 second reduction in the time trial performance, so about 1% when you unloaded the work of breathing. So again, it's modest, but both sexes showed a significant reduction in the time when you unloaded the respiratory muscles. And this modest reduction, though it should be put in the context of it was a fairly minor reduction in the work of breathing. So to sum up this section here, the high respiratory muscle work can cause a reflexive decrease in locomotor blood flow. So this blood flow redistribution, or is redistributed, to the respiratory muscles. And the physiological pathway here is when you have a lower blood flow to the locomotor muscles, you have a lesser oxygen delivery, and that will both decrease performance and increase fatigue. So if we move on now, this section I'll be talking about exercise-induced arterial hypoxemia. So this is really the exception to the rule. Whereas I said before, people are able to maintain blood gas homeostasis. This is the exception, and this is in that some, not all, but some highly trained athletes do not maintain blood gas homeostasis during maximal, and even actually in some cases submaximal exercise. So this is actually the original description of this hypoxemia. So on our y-axis, we have our arterial oxygen tension. Again, at rest, it's somewhere between 90 and 100 millimeters of mercury. And then it goes on the x-axis here from rest, maximal exercise. What you can see here is some individuals had no real change. Some individuals had a significant but relatively minor decrease. And then you see some individuals had quite a severe decrease in their arterial oxygen levels. And so this was done in very highly trained athletes. And this was done during treadmill exercise. And these are with direct measures of arterial blood gases. And again, what you really notice is some showed significant hypoxemia, upwards of 35 millimeters of mercury decrease from rest. So this is quite significant overall. And if you put this into a context, having an arterial oxygen tension of the mid-50s, which a few of these individuals do, that would be almost the equivalent of them being at about 3,500 meters elevation. So this is quite a significant insult to the system. And the other important thing is, look at the variability here. You have some that show absolutely no change and others show a severe change. And there's really no way of actually knowing ahead of time who's going to show this severe versus minor change. So the one thing we do know is that it does appear to be.
Excuse me, Mr. Paulo, Dr. Paulo, excuse me.
Yep.
Can translation please. دكتور وائل استسمع سعادتك التايم بتاع المحاضره هتعدينا نص ساعه دلوقتي عشان جزء الترجمه. دكتور عزمي فيصل بنرحب بحضرتك واتمنى مع الاخت الفاضله ريان يتم ترجمه الجزء اللي فات اللي احنا داخلين دلوقتي على اكثر من 25 دقيقه بحيث يتم ترجمه الجزء ده. ثانك يو دكتور باولو.
حسنا، شكرا جزيلا. سأقوم بترجمه الجزء الاول والثاني من المحاضره. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. لقد تناول الدكتور باولو دومينيلي في مداخلته موضوعا مهما حول ما إن كانت هناك تأثيرات سلبية للجهاز التنفسي على مستويات التحمل للرياضيين. يشير الدكتور إلى أن الدور الأساسي للجهاز الرئوي كما هو متعارف عليه خلال أداء التمرين يتمحور في الحفاظ على توازن الغازات التي يحملها الدم والحفاظ على ضغط الأكسجين الوارد من الشريان مرتفع، حيث أنه يجب تحقيق هذا التوازن بأقل جهد ممكن وللتقليل من الطاقة المستهلكة. وفي نفس السياق يتوافق رأي الدكتور مع الاعتقاد الشائع بأن الجهاز الرئوي لديه سعة كبيرة بالنسبة للطلب على نقل الحد الأقصى من الأكسجين وثنائي أكسيد الكربون لدى البشر الأصحاء الذين يمارسون الرياضة. ومع ذلك قد لا تنطبق هذه الحالة أثناء أداء التمارين الرياضية المكثفة بصفة مستمرة، حيث قد تتعدى التمارين قدرة الجهاز التنفسي. وفي محور آخر أشار إليه الدكتور باولو دومينيلي والذي يدور حول الجهاز الرئوي والتمرين. يلاحظ أن مستوى الأكسجين في الدم الشرياني لا يتغير بشكل ملحوظ خلال فترة الراحة لدى الشباب الأصحاء، وأي ضعف طفيف كان أو قويا في مبادلة الغازات على مستوى الرئتين ينتج عنه زيادة في التهوية. ويذكر الدكتور إلى أنه يمكن ملاحظة ذلك من خلال منحنيات حجم زفير الهواء الأقصى the Maximal Expiratory Flow Volume Curves. أما فيما يخص استجابة الجهاز الرئوي، أكد الدكتور أن التمارين الهوائية المنتظمة تؤدي إلى التحسين والارتقاء بالوظائف الحيوية، لكن من القلب والأوعية الدموية والعضلات، لتصل بذلك إلى أقصى قدرة في وظيفتها. وعلى عكس ذلك يظهر الجهاز الرئوي بعض التغيير لكن على المدى الطويل. كما ناقش الدكتور باولو دومينيلي آلية عمل عضلة الجهاز التنفسي، فمع زيادة عملية التهوية تزيد معها وتيرة عمل عضلات الجهاز التنفسي. وعلى هذا الأساس تظهر ضرورة القيام بتمرينات تخدم الجهاز التنفسي، وذلك بأداء تمرينات مكثفة لدى الفرد الرياضي. ذلك كل شيء. Dr. Paolo Dominelli, you may proceed.
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you.
So when we look at maybe the one aspect that can predict the exercise-induced arterial hypoxemia, what we find is it's really only in these very highly trained individuals. So if we look at this one table here, what we have are some individuals who are well-trained but not elite athletes. And they did 2 VO2 max tests, one breathing room air, 26% oxygen, and another breathing a slightly hyperoxic gas mixture, 26%. What you can see here is that their VO2 max was not statistically different on either of them. It showed a very minor but quite small increase breathing this hyperoxic gas mixture. They did have a higher oxyhemoglobin saturation, but it was only a couple percent. And this really probably wasn't enough to have an effect at all. Now you contrast that with highly trained individuals. So again, now they have a VO2 max of 70 mils per kilo. When they do the same thing, going from breathing room air to a hyperoxic gas mixture, 26%, they do have a significant increase in their VO2 max. And this is due to a much larger increase in their oxyhemoglobin saturation at maximal exercise. What we can see here is, well, in untrained individuals, this hyperoxia really has little effect versus those who have exercise-induced arterial hypoxemia. VO2 max will increase with hyperoxia. So put another way, they're actually limited to some degree by their ability to maintain arterial oxygen tension, because if you can reverse that, they can actually increase their VO2 max. So what impact does this hypoxemia have potentially on locomotor fatigue? So what we had here are a bunch of highly trained men and women. And again, they did a time to exhaustion at 90% of VO2 max. We did it again during two identical trials, one breathing 21% of room air and another breathing 26% oxygen, so slightly hyperoxic. We measured the quadricep fatigue via magnetic stimulation of the femoral nerve. So this is an objective measure of quadricep fatigue. What we saw here is on our x-axis, we have the lowest saturation during the room air trial. And on the y-axis, we have the fatigue attenuation between the two trials. So if we have a fatigue attenuation of 0, that means there was no difference in fatigue between the room air trial and the hyperoxia trial. Likewise, if we had 100% attenuation, that would mean all of the fatigue present during the room air trial was completely gone during the hyperoxia trial. So what you see here, though, is a nice linear relationship between the degree of hypoxemia, shown on the X, and the fatigue attenuation. In other words, those who had the most severe hypoxemia, about 90% saturation here, they had about 60% attenuation in the fatigue. So again, this is showing you that exercise-induced arterial hypoxemia will impact locomotor fatigue during exercise. And this is a nice linear relationship between the two of them here. So if we again now flip to a performance metric specifically, so in this study, what they had is a bunch of well-trained individuals, and they did a series.
Dr. Paolo, you only have 6 minutes left. I just want to let you know.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay.
So for this slide here, what we have is a bunch of well-trained individuals, and they performed a series of exercise trials, one in hypoxia, one in normoxia, and then there's just a slightly hyperoxic and then a largely hyperoxic. And what you can see here is a nice relationship whereby hypoxic trials have a reduction in performance, so slower time to complete the time trial. And then all the way up here to the hyperoxia, they have an improvement in performance. So again, this is just showing the degree of hypoxemia is going to be related to the degree of performance impairment. So overall, exercise-induced arterial hypoxemia affects some highly trained athletes, but not all, and that's they do not maintain blood gas homeostasis. So this results in a lower arterial oxygen content. The lower arterial oxygen content is lower oxygen delivery, and that will hinder performance and increase fatigue. So the last thing that I'll talk about, just a few slides here, are really sex differences in the respiratory system. So if you notice, almost all the previous work, save for a few that were completed in my lab, were all done on men. The question is, well, are women different? Well, it turns out that women have proportionally smaller airways than males. So what you can see here is these are lung-matched individuals, and each airway generation marked with the asterisk is significantly smaller in women. And we followed this study up by actually looking at in never smoking individuals. And again, these were all height matched, so we've taken height out of the equation. And you can see here, women in the black bars have significantly smaller airways in all of these central conducting airways. And it's about a third, 33% smaller. Why this matters is because the resistance to flow here, shown by this equation, is highly dependent on the radius that this liquid is flowing through. And so this has huge implications for airway resistance. And we see that now when we look at respiratory muscle energetics. So on the x-axis, we have ventilation, y-axis is the work of breathing. And you can see here that the work of breathing in women is significantly higher than men at every ventilation above about 60 liters per minute. And again, if we look at the oxygen consumption here, now again, we've just replaced the y-axis with the VO2 of the respiratory muscles. Again, about 50 to 60 liters per minute, women have significantly higher oxygen consumption of their respiratory muscles. So much so that even relatively well-trained but not elite women, upwards of 15% of their VO2 can be dedicated to the respiratory muscles, and that's about 4 to 5% higher compared to males. So as I said before, we think that this is due to resistance, and this is shown well in these few slides here. So we have, again, on each x-axis ventilation. On the left y-axis, we have the elastic work of breathing. So this is the amount of work done to just move the elasticity of the respiratory tissue. And this y-axis on the right is the resistive work. What we can see is there's no difference in the elastic work, which shows that the inherent elasticity between men and women is not actually different. What is different is this resistive work, and this resistive work is largely due to these smaller airways. So just a couple of differences that this actually makes is we find that women seem to show exercise-induced arterial hypoxemia more often. So this is a study we did. We're directly collecting arterial blood gases in a series of women performing treadmill exercise. And what we did is combine that with some other data here in some men. So on the x-axis, we have VO2, and on the y-axis, we have our arterial oxygen tension at max exercise. And what you can notice here is there's some untrained women here, which I'm kind of highlighting, who are developing hypoxemia. You don't see this in men. Likewise, if you put a regression line for the males and females, the females seem to develop more severe hypoxemia and to a greater degree than men. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about here, very briefly again, is just the quadricep fatigue. So we employed a similar protocol where we directly assessed quadricep function in a series of males and females during time to exhaustion trials. And we also unloaded the work of breathing at the same time during similar trials.
1 minute left, Dr. Paolo.
Yep, thank you. So what we found here is that in women, there was a significant reduction in twitch force. So quadricep fatigue was present during the control, and both unloading the respiratory muscles, shown with the triangles, and breathing hyperoxia attenuated locomotor fatigue. Now, if you look at men, surprisingly, it's actually identical. So even though we show more hypoxemia in women, and there's evidence that they may have more redistribution, the locomotor fatigue is actually not different between the two. And this is actually in line with others' work showing that the fatigability is about the same. So just in conclusion here, in healthy untrained individuals, the respiratory system is rarely limiting exercise capacity. However, high respiratory muscle work can result in a distribution of blood flow away to the locomotor muscles, and this hinders performance and increases fatigue. Some highly trained individuals can develop exercise-induced arterial hypoxemia. This too will increase fatigue and hinder performance. And there are notable sex differences in the pulmonary response to exercise, and these are largely the result of smaller central airways. So with that, I'd be happy to entertain any questions that anybody has.
Dr. Paolo Dominelli, we would like to thank you for granting us some of your precious time and for the enlightening knowledge you have shared with us today. I will be continuing the translation now. Thank you. وفي نطاق آخر استدل الدكتور على أن تقنيات التحفيز العصبي قد قدمت دليلاً علمياً وموضوعياً على أن الحجاب الحاجب وعضلات البطن تكون عرضة للإرهاق مع ممارسة التمارين الرياضية الشديدة بشكل مستمر. ويرجح الدكتور على أن التعب يرجع إلى ارتفاعات مستويات عمل عضلات الجهاز التنفسي مقترنة بزيادة المنافسة على تدفق الدم لمختلف العضلات الحركية، ما يسبب إجهادا للعضلات التنفسية، مما يزيد من تدفق ضيق في الأوعية، مما يؤدي إلى انخفاض تدفق الدم إلى العضلات العاملة، بالتالي إرهاقها. تطرق الباحث إلى عنصر مهم وهو الميتابورفلكس المرتبط بعمل وظائف الأعضاء، فهو يعبر عن العملية التي تكمن في الحد من تدفق الدم إلى الأطراف عند إصابة الجهاز التنفسي بالإجهاد. كما تطرق الدكتور إلى جزء مهم في محاضرته حول نقص تأكسد الدم في الشرايين الناجم عن ممارسة الرياضة أو ما يعرف بالهايبوكسيميا، والذي يتمثل في المستوى المنخفض والغير الطبيعي للأكسجين في الدم، أو بصورة أدق فهو نقص الأكسجين في الدم الشرياني. ويذكر الدكتور على الرغم من أن غالب الأفراد يحافظون على توازن نسبي في الغازات المحملة في الدم أثناء التمرين، إلا أن بعض الأشخاص وعلى وجه التحديد الرياضيين المدربين يمكنهم تطوير الهايبوكسيميا الناجم عن التمارين الرياضية. وهنا يجب الإشارة إلى أن نقص تأكسد الدم وشدته قد تختلف من الرياضي إلى آخر. وفي نفس السياق يذكر الدكتور الفروق بين الجنسين فيما يخص الجهاز الرئوي، حيث تتمتع الإناث في الحالة العادية برئتين ومسالك هوائية أصغر من الذكر كالقصبة الهوائية، حيث تكون أصغر بنسبة 10 إلى 30%، ويمتد الاختلاف كذلك ليشمل طول وحجم الرئة. وبالتالي فإن عملية التنفس من أجل التهوية والإمداد بالغازات يكون أعلى عند النساء، ونجد أيضاً أن الإناث أكثر عرضة من الذكور للهايبوكسيميا. شكراً.
شكراً. يعني نشوف الآن إذا في أي دكتور السيد، إيش رأيك تشوف لو في أي أسئلة قبل ما نبدأ مع سعادة البروفيسور مجدي في كمتحدث ثاني؟
يعني بنفتح باب الأسئلة مفتوح للأخوة الأفاضل المشاركين في الندوة لمدة 5 دقايق. أي حد عايز يفتح أسئلة أنا تحت أمركم يعني إن شاء الله بإذن الله. أي حد يعمل رايس هاند وأنا تحت أمركم. الصورة واضحة بالنسبة للأخوة الأفاضل المشاركين. في أي استفسارات؟
ايوه دكتور منير اتفضل.
خلاص في الدكتور مجدي. دكتور مجدي ابو زيد.
سيد لو مفيش اسئله انا ممكن اسال سؤالين.
طيب في دكتور مجدي ابو زيد ودكتور عزمي هيتفضل يشاركنا بكويشن معين ان شاء الله باذن الله. اتفضل استاذنا الفاضل دكتور مجدي ابو زيد.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Paulo, about your very interesting job. This is very nice to hear from you. I would like to ask you about what is the most important factor that we can say that is it differences between pulmonary function or cardiopulmonary efficiency between athletes, and what is the most sports activity can affect or impact on the lung volume? Thank you.
Sorry, I was having a little bit of troubles hearing that. So,
Paulo, I can just so Professor Magdi just basically asking you what is the type of athletic sports that could have impact on the lung volumes.
Yeah, so I guess which athletic activity would be most prone to kind of any of these phenomena that we're seeing? Yeah, so it would be really, this is endurance performance. So thinking of things like, 1,500 to longer kind of running races. So things that are eliciting a high degree of VO2 max, or longer cycling events. These are really endurance activities. We probably don't see any of these effects if you think of very short intensity, duration kind of sporting events. So this is really more endurance athletics rather than, say, competitive kind of team sports. You would not see this in, say, football, for example, or I don't think you would, where you have longer rest breaks between the athletic aspects.
سيد لو في اسئله من حد خليهم يسالوا، لو ما فيش انا ممكن اسال سؤال.
دكتور عزمي حضرتك تقدر تتفضل بالمشاركه بتاعت سعادتك بالنسبه للاسئله والمشاركه اللي حضرتك تدلي بيها يعني. اتفضل.
Paulo, thank you so much for your interesting talk. يعني I really enjoyed your talk today. Just to put this in sort of practical application for the athletes. So is there any way we can just distinguish those athletes with exercise-induced arterial hypoxemia for those they don't develop the exercise-induced arterial hypoxemia without the blood gases measurement? In terms of
So that's a really good question. Unfortunately, that's been something that's been very difficult. So there's no way to predict it ahead of time. So you couldn't say line up a bunch of athletes and say this person will develop it, this person will not. We know in general, the fitter the athlete, the more likely they are to develop it, but that's not always the case. You can have very fit individuals don't develop it. And then in terms of preventing it, that's again, unfortunately, during say a competition, there's not a lot you can do, because the best way or the only way that you can really prevent it is to have them breathe hyperoxic gas, which is of course not practical or really able to during an event. So there's some idea that maybe training, breathing a hyperoxic event will actually improve the training stimulus, but that's not conclusive. But it's a very unfortunate thing in that you can't really do a whole lot about it. So you just, I guess, have to be fortunate that you don't develop it. You can predict it with, say, a pulse oximeter, but that's good to a degree. But yeah, it's unfortunate. It's a problem that we've been had ongoing, is to figure out who can actually develop it and predicting why.
One last question, Paulo. Just this is just because Professor Magdi Abu Zaid, your next speaker, he did some amazing work in the late 70s looking for the breath holding. So what would be the main differences between hypoxic and breath holding in terms of the work of breathing and the physiological adaptation to the exercise performance?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. So there's a lot of similarities. Of course, breath holding, most likely I'm going to assume here is a very static thing. So the ones I'm familiar with are, say, like the breath hold divers. The big difference there is, you know, they're not respirating. Their respiratory muscles are largely inactive. The other thing is they're metabolically very inactive. And again, I know the, say, divers, they actually can slow down their metabolic activity. So when we think of the stress for the lungs, that's a lot less carbon dioxide building up. That's a lot less changes compared to, say, the elite athlete who has a VO2 or VCO2 of, you know, maybe upwards of 6-7 liters per minute. That's a lot of stress on the lung to exchange gas. So in terms of the control of breathing, I think they're very functionally similar in terms of kind of the alarm system, as you were, in the body, but how it's processed is kind of different ends of the spectrum. So they're the same, but there are quite a lot of differences here. One's, I think, an imposed kind of stress. The other is the exercise-induced arterial hypoxemia. The body's really just not able to keep up with the metabolic demands.
One last question. Would you recommend any intervention for the coaches and the athletes, especially for those endurance athletes, before the competition or during their training regime to improve their lung function?
Yeah, again, that's another very unfortunate aspect of the lungs, is that there seems to be very little that we can do that improves it. There is some evidence that inspiratory muscle training will have some benefits. There's also some evidence that shows that it doesn't. It's one of the ones, though, that there's really no downside to it. So I would say if individuals wanted to try it, it's not going to hurt the athletes by any means. It may help, it may not, but you know, it's kind of, I guess, one of the ones where you could try it and see if it's working. The other thing is, you know, these athletes are very sensitive to changes at altitude. So going to even very modest altitudes, they will see a decrement in performance, even 500-600 meters. So to get really optimal training out of athletes, high-end athletes, they should really be training as close to sea level as possible. Otherwise, they're just not able to get the training stimulus because they're actually developing more and more severe hypoxemia.
So I'd like to thank you, Pablo, for your outstanding presentation, and we would like to welcome you in person in the near future for one of the in-person conference at Alexandria University. Thank you again, and wish you all the best in your future career at Waterloo.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
دكتور منير، كان في سؤال.
السلام عليكم. سأقوم بترجمة سؤال الدكتور مجدي. ما هي وظيفة الجهاز الرئوي في الرياضات التي تتطلب التحمل؟ وكانت الإجابة كالتالي: لدينا الجري وركوب الدراجات التي هي رياضات متعلقة بقوة المداومة. والسؤال الثاني الذي يتمثل: يمكن التنبؤ إذا كان شخص سيصاب بنقص الأكسجين في الدم؟ الإجابة كانت كالتالي: لا يمكن التنبؤ إذا كان شخص سيصاب بنقص الأكسجين في الدم. شكرا.
دكتور منير، كان في لحضرتك سؤال ولا خلاص كان في راس هاند من سعادتك؟
اعتقد باولو خرج يا سيد.
دكتور باولو خرج. طبعا بنشكر حضرتك دكتور عزمي على مجهودك معانا، بس ارجو التو كويشن حضرتك كنت سالتهم الترجمه بتاعتهم.
والله هو المترجمه يعني هو كان في سؤال منهم: هل احنا فكره نقص الاكسجين بالنسبه لبعض الرياضيين دي حاجه احنا نقدر نتنبأ بيها قبل المسابقه او اثناء السباق، بحيث ان احنا لو عارفين ان المتسابق اللي هيجري السباق دوت هيحصل عنده فعلا نقص بالاكسجين في نهايه السباق، وده هيأثر على مستوى البرفورمانس بتاعه ولا لا؟ وللاسف ان احنا ما عندناش من طريقه واحده ان احنا نتنبأ بيها بنقص الاكسجين غير ان احنا ناخد عينات الدم ونشوف مستوى الاكسجين في الدم الشرياني، وده امر صعب ان احنا ننفذه في السباق يعني. فده بالتالي ما بنقدرش نستفيد بالمعلومه دي، او ما نقدرش ان احنا نتنبأ اذا كان في رياضي هيحصل عنده نقص في الاكسجين الشرياني ولا لا. وللاسف كمان ان برامج التدريب ذات نفسها ما تقدرش ان هي تطور من الجزئيه دي. الحاجه الوحيده اللي احنا نقدر نحسن بيها مستوى الاكسجين في الدم الشرياني ان احنا ندي اللعيب نسبه اعلى من الاكسجين، بنسميه هايبوكسيك جاسز، ان هو الجاز بيبقى نسبه الاكسجين اللي فيه بتبقى اعلى. لكن خلال المسابقات الرياضيه طبعا انت ما تقدرش تدي لعيب ان هو يتنفس جاز او اي حاجه تكون فيها نسبه اكسجين اعلى يعني. الحاجه الثانيه اللي كنا سالته سؤال من الاسئله المترجمه ما تدوش، يعني طبعا الدكتور مجدي ابو زيد يعني استاذنا، وهو كان عنده يعني شغل متميز جدا بالنسبه لعمليه كتم النفس. وكنت انا سالته سؤال بتاثيرات اللي هي تدريبات كتم النفس مع تدريبات الهايبوكسيك جاسز وتاثيرها على الاداء الرياضي، وهو كان يعني بشكل مبسط قال ان هم يمكن الناحيه الفسيولوجيه مختلفه، لكن التاثيرات على الرياضيين بتكون الى حد ما متشابهه على مستوى الاداء الرياضي يعني. وده كلام الاستاذ الدكتور مجدي كان يعني عمله من 30 40 سنه فاتوا يعني، فجزاه الله خير يعني. ده اعتقد دي كانت يعني مجمل النقاط اللي احنا اثرناها يعني في المناقشه بتاعت الاسئله.
شاكر افضل حضرتك دكتور عزمي، وطبعا بشكر مس ريان على الترجمه الجميله ومجهودها معانا.